Imagine a prince born into unimaginable luxury, destined to be the savior of a dynasty obsessed with power. He was pampered, spoiled, and worshipped as England's miracle heir. But behind the silks, jewels, and golden cradles, his body was crumbling from within. Henry VIII's only legitimate son, Edward VI, was supposed to secure the Tudor throne for generations instead. His death at just 15 would become one of the most gruesome tragedies in royal history. A death so horrific, Tudor officials tried to hide the truth.
Just sign
the
it, Your
Tudors were
Grace.
obsessed
Yes,
with
there's
survival.
no time to waste.
Kings could conquer armies, queens could command courts, but without a male heir, everything fell apart. For years, Henry VIII desperately sought a son, divorcing wives, breaking with the Catholic Church, and even executing those who stood in his way. And then, at last, in 1537, he got what he wanted, a boy named Edward. To the world, Edward was a miracle, proof that God had smiled on the Tudors. But miracles often come with a price, and Edward's life would prove it in the most haunting way. In October 1537, the bells of England rang out as if heaven itself had delivered a miracle. After years of failed marriages, miscarriages, and bitter disappointment, Henry VIII finally had what he had torn a kingdom apart to obtain, a legitimate son. The child was Edward, born to Henry's third queen, Jane Seymour. Bonfires lit up the night sky, feasts spilled across the streets, and cannons roared from the Tower of London to announce the arrival of England's future. The country exhaled in relief. For a dynasty as fragile as the Tudors, a male heir was more than just a child, it was survival. Henry had gambled everything for this moment. He had divorced Catherine of Aragon, severed England from Rome, executed Anne Boleyn, and married again and again in pursuit of one thing, a boy who could inherit his throne. Now, at last, here he was, but even as the celebrations echoed, a shadow fell over the Tudor court. Jane Seymour, the queen who had given Henry his miracle, was dying. Just days after Edward's birth, she succumbed to postnatal infection, leaving her son motherless before he was even christened. For Henry, it was a cruel irony. He had won his prize but lost the woman he claimed to love most. For Edward, it meant growing up without a mother's touch in a court that saw him not as a child, but as an object of power. From the very beginning, Edward's life was different. He was not cradled as a boy, but guarded as a relic. Nurses, physicians, and attendants swarmed around him, recording every cough, every shiver, every breath. To the Tudor dynasty, his body was not just flesh and bone. It was the fragile thread upon which their entire survival hung. If Edward fell ill, England's future crumbled with him. His christening was no simple religious ceremony. It was a spectacle worthy of kings. Cloth of gold draped the chapel. Silver basins of holy water shimmered in the candlelight. Music filled the air as priests intoned blessings over the tiny infant. Even before he could speak, Edward had been transformed into a symbol, the living proof that God and Henry's will had triumphed. Yet even as the nation celebrated, whispers followed him. Those who saw the baby closely noted his small frame, his pale complexion, his constant weakness. Was this truly the strong heir Henry had sacrificed so much to bring into the world? Few dared speak these doubts aloud. To question Edward's strength was to question the dynasty itself. And so the rumors were buried, and the child was wrapped tighter in silk, surrounded by constant prayers that he would live long enough to fulfill his destiny. Edward's birth was hailed as a triumph. But within the walls of the Tudor court, there was an unspoken truth. The prince who was supposed to secure England's future was already fragile, already vulnerable. And no crown, no feast, no prayer could change the fact that his destiny would always be balanced on the edge of a knife. Edward VI's childhood was the very definition of contradiction. On the surface, he was the most privileged boy in all of England, a prince whose every need was answered before he could even form the words to ask. His cradle was gilded, his clothes embroidered with gold thread, and his meals served on silver. His chambers were filled with attendants, nurses to feed him, tutors to shape his mind, physicians to monitor his fragile health, and courtiers who bowed lower for him than they did for his father's ministers, yet the luxury was also his prison. While other children of the age ran in fields and scraped their knees, Edward's world was tightly controlled. His toys were not simple playthings, but lavish creations, miniature suits of armor, carved figurines, and books bound in fine leather. His playtime was often solitary, watched from the shadows by anxious eyes. Every laugh, every stumble, every cough was observed and whispered about, not as the moments of a child's life, but as omens of England's future. From the very beginning, Edward was told he was special. He was not a boy, he was a king in waiting, the flesh and blood embodiment of his father's ruthless ambition. This message was drilled into him daily, both through words and through indulgence. If he wanted something, it was given. If he demanded attention, he received it. His very whims carried the weight of royal authority. By the age of 6, Edward was already seen as precocious. His tutors recorded his sharpness of mind, his passion for theology, his ability to debate scripture more fiercely than many grown men. But the boy behind the brilliance was lonely, frail, and constantly reminded of the burdens he carried. The spoiling wasn't just love, it was politics. Those who served him knew that their own fortunes rose and fell with Edward's health. Protecting him meant protecting themselves. Pleasing him meant gaining influence. And so Edward lived in a cocoon of smiles and deference, surrounded by people who would never tell him no, but even with this cocoon, his fragility showed. He tired easily, often excused from lessons when fever struck. Physicians experimented with strange remedies, bleeding, herbs, even charms, anything to preserve the boy who represented the entire Tudor dynasty. And still, he remained pale, thin, and sickly. It was a dangerous paradox. Edward was raised to believe in his own importance, spoiled into thinking he could never fail. Yet behind closed doors, whispers continued, whispers that he was weak, that his body could not bear the weight of the crown that awaited him. Those whispers would only grow louder as he grew older, and the golden cocoon of his childhood began to unravel. Edward's early years were the years of indulgence and illusion. To the world, he was a miracle prince, a spoiled heir destined to rule. But to those who looked closely, he was a child dressed in silk, hiding a body already betraying him, a future king living in luxury. Yet, walking in the shadow of death, Edward VI was painted for the world as strong, radiant, and full of promise. Court artists brushed away the shadows under his eyes, smoothing pale skin into a glow of health, placing him in armor or robes that gave the illusion of strength. To anyone who saw his portrait, he was the perfect heir, the golden Tudor boy destined to carry his father's throne into eternity. But reality is harder to paint over. Behind those flattering canvases lived a child whose body was breaking down long before his crown ever touched his head. Records from his youth speak in careful tones, indisposed, unwell, recovering, but those delicate words disguise a truth much harsher. Edward was often sick. He suffered recurring fevers, violent coughs, stomach pains, and exhaustion that left him unable to rise from bed for days at a time. Every illness sent ripples of fear through the court, for they knew that his survival meant the survival of England itself. Physicians, desperate to protect the boy, experimented with treatments that often did more harm than good. He was bled with leeches to balance his humors, dosed with concoctions of herbs and minerals, and sometimes subjected to rituals that bordered on superstition. If Edward cried out in pain, it was dismissed as the price of keeping him alive. In truth, many of these remedies only weakened his fragile body further. And yet, Edward was no fool. He may have been a child, but he sensed his own weakness. In his private diary, written in stark, blunt phrases, he chronicled his illnesses without emotion. He noted when his coughs returned, when fever overcame him, when treatments failed. It is as if he saw his own body not as a home, but as a crumbling fortress slowly surrendering to time. Still, the kingdom demanded strength. Edward was paraded on horseback, shown at ceremonies, and placed in front of cheering crowds, even when his body barely had the strength to sit upright. The illusion of a healthy prince was more important than the truth of his suffering. And so he learned to wear the mask of vigor, smiling through pain, standing straight while his legs trembled beneath him. Courtiers whispered about his fragility, but always behind closed doors. To question Edward's strength openly was treasonous. To admit he might not survive was to admit the Tudor dynasty was doomed. And so silence became his shield. It was in this silence that Edward's fragility festered. He was a boy who carried the weight of a kingdom but could barely carry his own body. He was spoiled, yes, but spoiled to hide the fear that at any moment the dynasty could collapse with him. The paintings showed a prince of power. The truth was a child fading slowly, a life lived in constant battle with sickness, where each day of survival was less a triumph of destiny and more a borrowed gift. In January 1547, the bells of England tolled for the death of Henry VIII, the once mighty monarch, swollen with disease and haunted by the ghosts of 6 wives, was gone, and in his place stood a child. Edward was just 9 years old when he was proclaimed King of England. He had been groomed for this moment his entire life, yet the crown that glittered on his head weighed heavier than anyone could have imagined. The coronation itself was a spectacle designed to mask reality. Crowds filled the streets, musicians played, and the boy king was paraded through London in a carriage covered with cloth of gold. In Westminster Abbey, he was anointed with holy oil, dressed in robes of state, and presented to his people as their sovereign. To the cheering masses, Edward appeared radiant, angelic, the embodiment of Tudor glory. But if they had looked closer, they might have noticed the pallor in his cheeks, the thinness of his frame, and the tremble in his hands as he held the orb and scepter. Edward was too young to rule, and everyone knew it. The throne may have belonged to him, but real power belonged to others. A council of regents, led by his uncle Edward Seymour, seized control. Seymour styled himself Lord Protector of the realm, effectively ruling in the boy's name. Edward sat in council meetings, his small voice sometimes asking questions, sometimes reading the speeches handed to him. But the decisions were made long before he entered the room, and yet Edward was not content to be a silent puppet. He took pride in his role as king, studying theology and politics with a zeal far beyond his years. He embraced Protestant reform, seeing himself as God's chosen instrument to push England further from the Catholic faith. At only 9, he spoke of heresy, scripture, and divine destiny as though he were a seasoned preacher. His diary entries from this period reveal a boy who believed in his sacred duty, but they also reveal a chilling detachment, as if he already saw himself not as a child, but as a vessel for God's will, behind the ceremonies. However, Edward remained a child in body and spirit. He still enjoyed music, games, and small pleasures, but his health betrayed him at every turn. During his coronation feast, observers noted how quickly he tired, how pale he looked under the candlelight. Even as nobles toasted his future, many quietly wondered whether he would live long enough to see it. The irony of Edward's kingship was stark. He was both the most powerful boy in Christendom and one of the most powerless. Draped in silks, seated on a throne, he was the face of England, but behind him, ambitious men pulled the strings, using his name as a shield for their own hunger. At 9 years old, Edward carried the crown his father had torn a nation apart to win. But it was not a gift, it was a burden. And as his reign began, it became clear that the boy king was less a ruler than a symbol, a fragile figurehead for a dynasty already trembling at its core. Edward VI wore the crown, but he did not wield the power. Behind the throne, 2 men rose in quick succession, each using the boy king's weakness as a ladder for their own ambition. The first was Edward Seymour, the king's uncle. As soon as Henry VIII was buried, Seymour moved swiftly to secure control. He declared himself Lord Protector of the realm, a title never officially recognized in English law but enforced through sheer power. Seymour draped himself in the language of guardianship, claiming he was only safeguarding the boy's reign until Edward came of age. But in practice, he ruled as king in all but name. Seymour's government was riddled with greed and failure. He enriched himself, granting vast estates and titles to his allies. He pursued aggressive religious reforms, tearing down altars, stripping churches, and pushing Protestantism further than the country was ready to accept. The result was chaos, rebellions erupted across England, peasants rioted over enclosures, and the fragile economy buckled. Seymour's arrogance was legendary. He had the king's ear, and that was all the power he needed, but ambition breeds enemies. Seymour's rivals, jealous of his influence, conspired against him. In 1549, he was overthrown and imprisoned in the Tower of London. 2 years later, he was executed for treason, leaving Edward without his protector but still trapped in a web of power-hungry men. The next figure to seize control was John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Unlike Seymour, Dudley was cunning, pragmatic, and ruthlessly strategic. He understood that Edward was not just a sickly boy, he was a symbol to be weaponized. Dudley did not parade himself as protector. Instead, he manipulated Edward directly, flattering him, convincing him that he was a godly ruler making his own decisions. In truth, Dudley was the one writing the decrees, pulling the strings, and orchestrating the future. Dudley's greatest scheme was tied to Edward's health. By 1553, it was clear the boy king was dying. His coughing fits, wasting body, and fevered nights were impossible to hide. With Mary and Elizabeth next in line, Dudley faced disaster. If Edward died, his Protestant reforms would be undone, and Dudley's enemies would triumph. So he convinced the young king to alter the succession, disinheriting both his sisters in favor of Lady Jane Grey. Dudley's own daughter Law. It was a desperate gamble, and Edward, earnest and devout, believed it was the will of God. He signed the documents with trembling hands, sealing his own legacy and plunging England toward crisis. In the end, the puppet masters used Edward's name as both shield and sword. To the public, he was the boy king defending the true faith. In reality, he was the frail figurehead of man whose greed devoured the kingdom from within. The tragedy was this: Edward wanted to be king. He believed in his divine mission, but he was never more than a mask, a symbol held up while others carved their futures behind his fragile, fading body. By 1553, Edward's condition could no longer be hidden. His coughing grew violent, his skin turned ghostly pale, and he wasted away before the eyes of his courtiers. The boy who had been paraded as England's miracle now looked like a skeleton in royal robes. His illness was cruel. Fever racked his body, sores covered his skin, and his hair fell out in clumps. Some accounts say his fingernails blackened, his breath carried the stench of decay, and his body swelled with fluids. His screams echoed through the palace at night, yet the council kept up appearances, insisting the king was merely recovering. Edward himself knew better. In his final writings, he pleaded with God for mercy. His once-calm diary now filled with the desperation of a boy facing death. For weeks, his body broke apart piece by piece. A living corpse forced to linger while ambitious men circled like vultures. On July 6, 1553, Edward VI finally died. Official accounts described a peaceful passing. The truth was far darker. Witnesses wrote that his body convulsed violently, that he screamed in agony, that his flesh seemed to rot even before death. Some historians believe he suffered from advanced tuberculosis, others from cancer or even poisoning, but all agree his end was gruesome. His final moments horrified those around him. The once celebrated heir, the boy of golden promise, died not as a king but as a broken child. His body was hurriedly covered, his death cloaked in false dignity, because the reality was too disturbing for England to face. To the public, he was mourned as a saintly prince. Behind palace walls, courtiers whispered of the stench, the horror, the fear etched into their memories. Edward's death unleashed chaos. John Dudley tried to install Lady Jane Grey, sparking one of the bloodiest succession crises in English history. Mary Tudor, Edward's Catholic sister, rallied support and seized the throne, executing Jane and Dudley in turn. But what of Edward? His short reign was rewritten in chronicles as noble and godly, erasing the painful truth of his decline. Portraits continued to show him healthy and strong. His diaries were carefully preserved, yet edited to hide weakness. History itself became a cover-up, designed to protect the illusion that the Tudors had produced a worthy heir. In reality, Edward's reign was not a triumph but a tragedy. A boy too weak to live, yet too important to be allowed the dignity of silence, Edward's horrific death was more than personal tragedy. It changed the fate of England. His failure to survive opened the throne to Mary, then Elizabeth, reshaping religion, politics, and empire. His absence haunted the dynasty his father had destroyed kingdoms to secure. The Tudors had gambled everything on a fragile boy, and lost every stitch of silk, every jewel, every prayer poured into Edward's life could not save him from the
Lord,
one enemy no king can escape, death. His story is not just about a spoiled prince, but about the illusion of power, and how even the greatest dynasties rest on fragile bones. Which part of Edward's tragic life struck you most? His pampered childhood, his puppet kingship, or his horrific death? Share your thoughts below. And if you want more dark, hidden stories of history's forgotten figures, subscribe now because this is only the beginning.